Hey everybody, it's Kyle. Welcome back to the channel. It's been a while since I've made any videos. I just kind of took some time off. I was working a lot, read some books, played some video games, just kind of took some time away, which was great. But now I have a lot of books that I've read that I want to talk about, a lot of videos that I want to make. So I feel like I want to hopefully record a few videos at a time and start releasing some of the stuff that I've had planned. I didn't even do my June wrap up, and so that is what it is. I'm just behind. I'm pulling an Allen here. One of the things that made me keep procrastinating doing my wrap-ups is that I tend to read a lot of books, which is great. I love that I read a lot of books, but a lot of them are like audiobooks that I listen to, and I don't have that many thoughts on them. They're just kind of like average, or it's just like a review copy of something that I got that is good, but I don't have that much to say about it, or it's just like a backlog light read. Whatever the case may be, I always have a bunch of books that I don't feel like I have a lot to say about. But I don't want to miss them in a wrap-up, so I feel like I would have to talk about them. And then there's the whole stress of how long the video is going to be now that I'm talking about, like 25 books or whatever. So for June, especially, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hit the highlights. I am not going to talk about every book that I read. I'm just going to kind of do a quick overview, and I'm going to see how that feels. That might be something that's easier for me, because a lot of the books, if I don't have that much to say about them, then I'm not going to really convince you to read them anyway. So we'll see how that goes for my June wrap-up. So think all the way back to June. I had a pretty good reading month. It had some highs and lows in it. I read a total of 28 things, which sounds like a lot, I know. But 4 things I DNF'd. So 4 things I did not finish, so I finished 24 things. And the 4 DNFs were Muse of Nightmares by Lonnie Taylor. I just felt like this story wasn't going in the places that I really wanted it to. It was way more romance focused, even more than the first one. And by the time the plot kind of started picking up, I was kind of just over the whole book. And there was a point where I was listening to the audiobook, and then I had zoned out for like half an hour, and I realized I'd have to go back half an hour. And I was just like, I absolutely don't want to do that. And I was like, oh, I'm just reading this book to finish it. So I just DNF'd it. I don't think it's a bad book. I don't think my head was in the right space for it. Perhaps I'll try it again some other time, but I just wasn't really feeling it. The next DNF I had was Breakfast of Champions by Kurt Vonnegut. It was my second Vonnegut book. I was listening to it. It's narrated by John Malkovich, and I just didn't get it at all. I don't think Vonnegut is the guy for me. He's supposed to be really funny, and I did think some lines were a little funny, but I just mostly was like, this is bizarre. I don't know why I'm listening to this. So I stopped that one. I also DNF'd In the Shadow of the Lightning by Brian McClellan. I tried to read that all month. I was excited for it. I got an ARC, so thank you, NetGalley. But I just could not care. I got 25% into the book, and I just was dragging, punching, and screaming and clawing my way to read that. And it just wasn't worth it. So that book just wasn't for me. I've heard middling reviews otherwise, so I don't think it was just me on that one. I will probably try some more Brian McClellan at some point, but that book didn't enthuse me very much for that. And the last book that I DNF'd is The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. Admittedly, I had a couple friends who hated this book, and I kind of went into it expecting to not like it that much, but I expected to not like it that much because they were telling me that the horror elements weren't well done. But what I found was I didn't like it because I was bored out of my mind. Thought it was really boring. I don't know, I just, people talk about how the themes of it and the indigenous experience is really well handled, and that might be the case, but I just felt like the actual writing style and the stuff going on was just very boring, and I just could not bring myself to care about any of the characters. There was a character that died that had been around for the whole book, and I was just like, wow, I don't care about this at all. Time to pack it in. So those were my 4 DNFs. So I finished 24 things. A lot of the things I finished were in the 3 to 4 star range. I had a lot of just good books, and there's nothing wrong with a good book. A 3-star read is not a bad thing, but a lot of 3-star reads I don't have that much to say about. So here's a couple books that I read in June that I have more to say about. So the first book that I'm going to talk about is a book I absolutely did not like at all. I give this book a 3 out of 10. I don't understand why it's so popular, and that is The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. This book is extremely popular, and I don't get it at all. The messaging in this book is extremely bad, and I'm not one to hate on a book generally because I don't agree with the message. Usually even just the act of having a thought process, engaging with the book, realizing why I disagree with the book, I think that's valuable. And it's not that I don't think I got anything valuable from this book, it's that the popularity of The Midnight Library, I think, worries me about humanity, about our current society, because I don't understand why so many people liked this book. And if you did like it, that's great. I'm not, people can like what they like. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is culturally, to really love this book that kind of basically is, in my opinion, saying, oh, well, if you're having suicidal thoughts, you should just get over it and think happier thoughts, and then you'll be fine. If you just think about the good things in life, then you will no longer have these problems. You won't be suicidal. You want to live your life. You can just choose to live your life better. And I think the author was going for, to give him credit, I think he was going for, just like a happy, wholesome message of like, life can always get better, and you can affect change. But it did not read that way to me. It made me very angry. It was like he took the most basic understanding of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is that you can change your cognitions to over time change the way that you view the world, get rid of your negative thought permutations, and then you will hopefully over time not be as depressed, or you can even not be depressed anymore. Like I was depressed for a really long time, and I used a lot of CBT practices to help myself get out of that. And it seems like he took one line of that and was like, wait, you can change the way you think? Great. And then he just didn't do any more research, and he just made the stupid-ass story. And it would be one thing if the story itself was good. I don't think it was. I think it was very boring. I think it was very predictable. The concept is cool, but I just don't think he did anything cool with the concept. And I could tell where the whole thing was going by like 60% into it. I just knew exactly what was going to happen. And, yeah. I don't know, man. I don't know. I did not like this book at all. One of the worst books that I've read probably ever, but definitely this year. And it's not even a disappointment because I didn't expect it to like it that much, but I wanted to see what the hype was. It didn't work for me at all. If you really liked it, that's great. I know some people it did really inspire, and I'm happy for you. I just think that it also has the potential to give people the wrong message, and I don't really agree with that. So that's where I'm at with that one. The next book I want to talk about is probably my biggest disappointment of the month for sure, but it might even be one of my biggest disappointments of the year, and this really pains me that I did not like this book that much, and that is Kings of Ash by Richard Nell. This is the second book in the Ash and Sand trilogy, a self-published trilogy by Richard Nell. And Richard Nell was nice enough to send me this whole trilogy signed, and I absolutely love the first book, so thank you so much, Richard. I appreciate that you sent this to me, and because of that, I'm going to honor that and be honest. I did not hate this book, but I was very much disappointed by it. So the Ash and Sand trilogy follows two characters, Ruka and Kale, that come from different cultures, and Kale is kind of from like a Viking-esque northern landscape that's very harsh and tough, and he has a lot of like forbidden magic, and he's an outcast, and he's an extremely complex, fascinating character. And then there's Kale, who is kind of more from like a Pacific Island culture, and he's a prince, and he goes off and he has to find out what's going on with his stuff. I don't want to spoil the first book, but the reason I did not like this book is that the structure of this trilogy does not work for me at all. And it really pains me to say that. So the first book ends on a couple of cliffhangers, and I was fine with those cliffhangers. And then in this book is a flashback and then a secondary flashback. So most of this book takes place before the start of the first book, Kings of Paradise, and it's just like a really long flashback sequence, and the longer it went on, the more I did not like it. And what ended up happening was I started getting really angry that this story was told this way, because there was large chunks of the narrative that it didn't make sense to be telling me this in the second book. It would have made more sense to me in the first book, and it really felt contrived to where we were only getting it this way so we could get a cliffhanger at the end of the first book. And so it made me retroactively appreciate the first book less, because the cliffhanger was so clearly not the actual ending point of that part of the story. It flashed forward twice, and then it went back and filled in these gaps, and I just did not appreciate that at all. Also, this book has the worst case of miscommunication trope I've ever seen in my life. It made me furious. I just couldn't believe it. There were a bunch of characters that all knew different information, and they were all together, and none of them shared that information, to the point where catastrophes happened. And I just couldn't believe it. I was like, this is absolutely outrageous. I cannot stand this. And I was just so furious at this book at that point. And I'm going to be honest, I might not finish this trilogy. There's only one book left in the trilogy. It is the shortest book, and I still don't know if I want to finish it. And that makes me really sad because of how much I like the first book. Also, to say some positives, I think that Richard Nell writes extremely good combat sequences. I think he's really good with character. Both of the main characters of this series, Kale and Ruka, especially Ruka, are very, very fascinating characters. Ruka is one of my, I think, favorite characters that I've ever read about. Everything that he does is very good, and he's the main character of this book. He's in most of this book. And so that would lend a lot of weight to me enjoying it, but just the structure and the climax just didn't work for me, and I'm really sad about it. And, I've talked to people who have finished the whole trilogy, and they told me that I probably won't like it, based off my feelings on this one. But the completionist in me, and the fact that Richard was nice enough to send me the whole trilogy, I think I'll just close it off, but this was extremely disappointing to me. I gave this a 6.5 out of 10, just because individually, a lot of the scenes are really good, and Ruka is great, and the combat was really great. It's just like, as a cohesive story, it just fell really flat for me. The next book I want to talk about is another book that I had mixed feelings on, trending a little bit more positive than the last one. This one is Malice by John Gwynne. I started with the Bloodstone trilogy by John Gwynne, and I really, really love that trilogy, and I knew going back I wasn't going to get as much out of Malice. Even people who start with Malice say that there's some issues with pacing and with characters, and certainly had my problems with this book. I feel like it overused the murderous bully trope. I think there were way too many characters, and I'm a person who loves characters, but it just felt like they weren't introduced in a way that is conducive to people knowing who they are. The characters don't behave in a way where, like, consequences really have an impact on them. Like, people will lose family members, and they'll be sad for, like, a paragraph, and then they'll just never mention it again. And I'm like, well, I think these people would be more upset about this. This is a family member, or this is a close friend. There's like a point in this book where somebody loses somebody close to them in a horrific way, and they're sad about it for basically one page, and then it's just literally never brought up again, almost. Like, I think it's mentioned one more time. And I just kind of struggle with that kind of stuff. I think this book introduced too many POVs. A couple of them weren't necessary, or were maybe setting up things for another book that I don't feel like fully impacted Malice. And then my final criticism would just be that I don't feel like the female characters were that well handled. But I do know, as a caveat right now, that John Gwynne handles female characters extremely well in Bloodsworn trilogy. So I have every confidence that this will continue to get better. I don't think they were bad. I just don't think they were particularly good. But all of the negatives aside, what I did like about Malice is that the action sequences were really good. I think the world building, while people kind of say it isn't a strong suit of it, it did its job adequately. Like, I don't feel like I needed more in terms of being able to ground myself in this story. This was immensely readable. I read it very quickly. I liked most of the characters. I thought the villains had a really interesting perspective. The lore and everything that's going on, I want to know more about. I thought even there was like a Chosen One prophecy that is like a pretty standard fantasy trope, but I actually really liked it. I thought it was really well done. And more than that, I just really also want to pick up Valor quickly, which to me speaks more to how much I enjoyed the book than anything else. At the end of the book, I was kind of exhausted by some of the things. The murderous bully tropes was really getting on my nerves. But then when I put it down, I was like, oh, I really want to be back with these characters again. I really want to know where things are going. And it's like grieved me that I didn't get to Valor in July. So I gave this, at the time, a 6.5 out of 10. I think I will actually bump it up to a 7 out of 10, which is a 3.5. I really want to be back with these characters, and I really want to continue on with Valor sooner than later. So consider this mostly a success with a little bit of mixed. The next book I want to talk about is a book I wanted to read for a really long time. The author is from my city. I feel like a bad Canadian if I haven't read his books, and everybody just says that he's one of the best prose writers, and that is, of course, Tigana by Gavriel Kay. Now, I, upon finishing this book, refer to it as the best 4-star book that I've ever read. And what I mean by that is that there's a lot to enjoy here in Tigana. I am so glad that I read this book, and I will definitely be reading more Gavriel Kay. But I had some issues with it that never really properly resolved for me. The first being that Devon, the main character, I feel like is just kind of an afterthought in his own story. He just kind of feels like a camera for most of the book, and there are much more interesting characters around him. It's not that I think Devon is a bad character. I don't think he makes the narrative worse. I just don't think he had enough to do inside of the story. So Tigana, if you don't know, is a story about a sorcerer that makes people forget about Tigana. They now refer to it as Lower Corte, and all the people from Tigana are the only people that can remember the name of Tigana, but everybody else in the world doesn't know the name. And then the people from Tigana can only remember the place that they were from and the name if somebody from there says the name to them. So it's kind of like tag, but for memory. So you follow two characters, primarily Devon and Dianara. And Devon is a musician in a town somewhere, and he gets pulled into a plot to kind of influence the politics of the peninsula. And then you have Dianara, who became the paramour of Brandon, who is the sorcerer that did this to everybody. And Brandon, by the way, is an extremely fascinating villain. I thought he was really well done. Dianara is also awesome. In fact, for this being a 90s fantasy book, the women are the characters that have the most agency, the most dynamic stuff going on with them. More of the male characters tend to be one note, even though some of them are really good. But my problem with this book, beyond Devon, is that the climax didn't really deliver what I wanted it to. And I can't get into this because of spoilers, but it feels like the book overall is talking about culture and collective memory and identity. And maybe it was just because I had gotten off reading Ken Liu's Dandelion Dynasty, where it also kind of tackles similar themes, but in a different way. But it just felt to me like it was never really... the culture of the people from Tigana was never really touched upon enough. Like, I had to fill in a lot of the work as to why these people would care about remembering the name Tigana. Because I know as a reader that this is something that is important to them, but it never feels as if they care about anything besides remembering the name. Like, I don't feel like they're ever trying to get their culture back, which to me is more important than the name, is that they want to remember the name, to remember where they're from, their culture, things like that. And then finally we have to talk about the big problem everybody always talks about, which is the sex scenes in this book, which I kind of think were overblown and also not. I think there's only 3. I might have forgotten one, but the first one is fine. It's actually even kind of plot relevant. Nothing about it. If you read any other books with sex scenes in them, you're going to be fine. The second one, not a huge fan of it. And then the third one, oh man, that one is awkward. It's like 3 or 4 pages long of it's just descriptions. And I was like, and, you know, I'm probably exaggerating. If somebody has actually looked inside of it and it is like, it's actually only a page and a half, I don't care. That's not my point. My point is, it was a very long sex scene. And it was just like, dude. And I was like driving while I was listening to it, and I was like, I can't even fast forward. So that is there, and that is something. The other thing about Tigana is that it is a slow book. I don't think it would be for everybody, but the prose is incredible. I really think Gavriel Kay is one of the best prose writers I've ever seen. When people talk about how good he is, I totally get it. So I'll be reading more of him, but Tigana was not my favorite book. But I absolutely think that you should give it a try because it was excellent. Another book I read in June that I just want to highlight briefly is Alexander Hamilton by Ron Chernow. This book is huge. It is 850 pages. I listened to it on audio. I did not read this behemoth of a book. I listened to it, and I listened to it forever. It just felt like I was born. I started listening to Alexander Hamilton by Ron Chernow, and then I'm still listening to it. Part of me thinks I will always be listening to it. Okay, it wasn't that long, but it did feel very long while listening to it. I felt every single one of these 800 pages. And the amount of people that I would recommend this to is exactly the people who listened to me say that and said, I definitely would like to read a book about Alexander Hamilton for 800 pages, because that's what you're going to get. And it did its job admirably, very well. I think Chernow's a great writer. I think he made so much of this interesting. The middle parts were a little sloggy just because it was more boring stuff. But I will say that if you want to know a lot about Alexander Hamilton, just watch the musical. I mean, this is the highest compliment to Lin-Manuel Miranda, but he nailed it. He really did. And I read this hoping to get more information, and I technically did. I got a lot of information about Alexander Hamilton. I feel like the musical hits all the most important points. So if you watch the musical and you think that's all the things I need to know, then great. But if you want to read 800 pages about Alexander Hamilton, this is the book for you. It is a real good one, and I gave this 8.5 out of 10. This is a really good book if you are interested in it. Next, I want to talk about Hyperion by Dan Simmons. I don't own a physical copy. This is The Fall of Hyperion by Dan Simmons. The cover is almost the same. Just imagine it doesn't say The Fall of on it, and then you're golden. Hyperion was a book that has been hyped up to me. It absolutely lived up to the hype. One of the most emotional, provocative, thought-provoking books I've ever read. One of my favorite sci-fi books of all time. But this follows 6 pilgrims on their way to Hyperion to deal with the Shrike, which is an alien figure that's kind of guarding the time tombs. And I thought this was excellent. 2 of the stories in Hyperion, the Scholar's Tale and the Priest's Tale are two of the best pieces of fiction I've ever read. It was absolutely excellent. I gave Hyperion a 9.5 out of 10. I cannot recommend it highly enough to fantasy fans, to sci-fi fans, to honestly, just try it no matter what genres you like. It's every genre anyway, so highly recommend. Next, I want to talk about Scenes from My Life by Michael K. Williams. This is a posthumously released memoir by Michael K. Williams. I talked about this a bit in books that I was looking forward to, and I finished it in June, and I just thought it was absolutely excellent. Michael K. Williams was such a tortured, honest soul. He spoke so eloquently about emotions, and I feel like you could really see that in the way that he acts, in the roles that he picks. There are so many thought-provoking or emotional lines in this book, and I just really felt the power of them, especially all the times where he's talking about, like, almost dying or deciding he wanted to live, and then, of course, knowing that he eventually succumbed to drug addiction. I mean, it just made the whole thing more sad. The only thing I would take away from this book would be it was intended to be published this way, which it wasn't, because the second half of the book kind of just focuses on all his like philanthropy and charity work and stuff, which is all great, but then it just kind of ends. It doesn't really talk about the second half of his life very much, and you can tell that was because it was not finished, but it was absolutely excellent. It was with complicated topics like drug addiction, racism, gangs, all sorts of other things like the power of art and the school-to-prison industrial pipe and the school-to-prison pipeline and all these other things. I just feel like it's a very enlightening read, and I cannot recommend it highly enough to honor Michael K. Williams and to learn about the struggles that many other people face. So I gave this a 9.5 out of 10. On that note, another book that was similar in a sense in terms of how much I enjoyed it and the reasons why is one of my books of the month, and that is Finding Me by Viola Davis. I talked about this already in a different video, but I just thought this memoir was absolutely incredible. I think Viola Davis just nailed telling her life story, and the book is so powerful and evocative, and it deals with if you're worried about reading a celebrity memoir, don't. I don't think she name drops a single person. I think Cecily Tyson is mentioned a couple times, but otherwise it is just entirely about her and her family and her kids and her husband and her ex-husband and the things that she had to deal with growing up and the effects of intergenerational racism and the effects of poverty on a family and just all of these things. Sexism in the workplace, sexism in families, sexism in the black community, all just so many of these things that she was dealing with. And there's a part of the book where she's talking about a scene in How to Get Away with Murder, which is a show that she stars in. And in this scene, she takes off her wig on camera and is like taking off her makeup and stuff. And I've watched the show. I remember seeing this scene, and she's talking about how important that scene was to her and how she fought. She was like, I will only be a lead in this show if I'm able to take off my wig, and all of these things that meant to her and why that's a big deal. And it was something that I was vaguely aware of. I've heard other black women speak about this, but just the way she spoke about it just changed how I view not only that scene, but like parts of how I view art. And it was just an incredible book. I highly recommend it, especially the audiobook. She narrates it herself. It was exquisite. That was a 10 out of 10 read for me, and one of my favorite books this year for sure. And the last book I want to talk about, which is tied for my book of the month with Finding Me, is Lord of the Silver Bow by David Gemmell. Now this is another book I talked about recently in a video. I think this book was so good. I thought it was amazing. I didn't expect to like it as much as I did. It was my first David Gemmell. And if you don't know what this is about, it is about, it's like a retelling of the Iliad, except not really. If you go into this knowing the Iliad, there's almost nothing in this book that happens in like the traditional story. It takes place a little bit before. It's setting up a lot of other stuff. There are characters that appear, like Odysseus is a supporting character, Priam's a main character, Hector's mentioned a bunch, things like that. Paris makes a brief appearance, things like that. But it's mostly telling the story of three characters, Androme, who I'm saying her name wrong, I'm sure, Helicon, who is a character we know already, and then Arjurius, who is a fictional character. And Arjurius is kind of one of Agamemnon's like chief warriors. And it's telling this interweaving story about the political system in Troy. And one of the things I liked about it is that it's really talking about like the political machinations of Troy itself, and it kind of paints Troy in a less heroic light. Like it's not like Troy is suddenly the villains in this, but it's more like it's shades of gray, which in history it would have been. You know, it wouldn't have been that they stole a woman and then now Troy just has to defend her honor and stuff like it. You know, Troy's up to their own things, and most of the book revolves around stuff going on inside of Troy that's kind of not dealing much with Agamemnon and stuff and the traditional narrative of Troy. You can tell that's probably coming soon, like it's more of a setup in that sense, but it still tells, I would almost say this tells a standalone story. It is first in a trilogy, you can see where it's leading to, but I would say the main reason you would know that this isn't a complete story is that you would know that the story of Troy is happening and that didn't happen yet, but you could just read this book and stop. It tells a complete narrative, and the end of this book was so good. Like, absolutely blew me away. I could not stop reading it. I had tears in my eyes for like 20 pages. I was hyped. I was cheering. There were so many cool things going on. Also, for people who are like a little battle phobic, there's not very many battles in here. There's like 2 maybe, and 1 isn't very long. It's way more about politics and about characters and relationships. I feel like David Gemmell expertly draws character relationships, and dialogue is great. I don't have really any negatives for this book. My only negative would be a case of insta-love, kind of, but even within the narrative, it's kind of framed in a way that's like a little bit more mythical, because there's like hints of magic in this story, and so I think it works in the case of this book, but it's kind of a trope I don't like. But other than that, I have nothing negative for this book. I cannot wait to continue the trilogy, and I really hope people pick up this book because I feel like it's slept on a little bit in circles that I frequent, although me and Sarah reads and Andrew's Wizardly reads and a couple people on the Discords all read this recently and gave it 5 enthusiastic stars. I give this a 10 out of 10 without a doubt. Ironically, I wasn't going to talk about all the books that I read this month in an effort to make this video shorter, and I feel like it's going to be the same length anyway because I got really excited about all the books I did read, and in my brain I was like, well, I can talk about them a little bit longer because I'm not talking about 28 books. So maybe I went to the same length, but hopefully we got a little bit more out of each of the books I did talk about and chose to highlight so you get a bit more of a sense about how I felt about them. But yeah, June was a really good reading month. I had read some excellent books, and I read some good books. There were a couple disappointments, but thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe if you want to see more videos. I really appreciate it, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.